I know, this is what you wanted. Have you been waiting for it? Hello everyone, I'm Vlad Spara, and I know a lot about Luger, having spent much time with it. In desperation, I once made a history video solely about this weapon. I once had recordings, but lacked time to make a proper video, so I avoided it for years. But today we finally get to take a look at the history, mechanics, operation, and of course, the test of this iconic, very iconic weapon. First of all, for those who don't know me, know that we are now going back to the studio. We are going to have a very long history lesson because this weapon has a very long history and represents an important milestone, but also a dead end in the history of weapon development. Red, let's go. Here we are in the calm of the study where I can properly tell you the story of the Luger. What I find extremely interesting about the Luger is that its genesis can be traced far back. Before we get to Georg Luger, of course we'll get there, we must first mention three important characters who make up the pieces of this puzzle, of this story of an iconic weapon. The first piece. It's Walter Hunt, a person you may have never heard of, but he was an American inventor of the mid-800s. We all deal with a Walter Hunt invention every day without even knowing it. Well, the safety pin is his patent, perhaps his most famous patent of all. It seems almost strange that something as simple and mundane as a safety pin is such an old invention, yet it is. It's not so mundane. If you think about it, someone must have invented it along with the technique for making it. Walter Hunt also invented something else. He had an idea for a repeating weapon. This repeating weapon made use of special ammunition that were in fact bossless ammunition. We could say today caseless, which contained the launching charge in the base of the ammunition. For the repeating mechanism, there was a lever and a shutter that was closed by a knee joint. We are obviously talking about the volcanic pistol from the Volcanic Repeating Arms Company, founded in 1855 specifically to produce this weapon. From two other major names in weapons, Mr. Smith and Mr. Wesson, who later with others will found the famous Sweet & Wesson. However, the Volcanic isn't doing well. In fact, this pistol, despite the very high potential of the toggle lock and the lever action system, used ammunition that was too weak. Oliver Winchester, the largest shareholder of Volcanic, effectively took over the company. Through improvements to the Volcanic system, we get the Henry rifle, designed by an employee of Oliver Winchester, Benjamin Tyler Henry. And then, with further improvements, we will have the long series of the very famous Winchester lever-action rifles. Lever-action rifles that everyone used until, of course, the arrival of John Moses Browning, and therefore the change in the operating system of these rifles. They used a knee joint for the closure. Simply, a knee joint shutter is composed of three elements. The shutter itself, which only moves horizontally, and two elements that can be aligned between the shutter and the weapon's castle, completing the closure. Or they can be broken, that is, moved out of alignment, thus allowing the movement of the shutter. This system has the great mechanical advantage that it transfers the movement, let's call it the lever, so a rotational movement into a horizontal movement of the shutter. The second protagonist comes into play. We have already seen it too, we have already talked about it too. The father of the machine gun, Hiram Maxim, another American, among other things, he was also an extremely prolific inventor. Think that at a certain point, he himself patented the incandescent bulb. But in fact, he lost the race for this patent, the priority of the patent, with Thomas Edison. Maxim was particularly active in the field of lighting and the operation of gas systems. He made a lot of money with these systems. These systems will decrease, especially as electricity spreads. When this was still the case, race between gas and electricity, gas seemed like a very sensible investment. And Maxim was almost the king of gas equipment, we could say. The anecdote goes that at one point in Europe, he meets a friend of his, an American Jew, who suggests him to leave electricity and gas alone and to invent something that allows Europeans to kill each other more efficiently. Hiram Maxim was a sports shooter himself. And the anecdote goes that while he was shooting the Traptor Springfield 1873, which has a fairly powerful cartridge, the 45-70, and seeing its recoil, he thought about how maybe the energy of this recoil could be used to do something more. Hiram Maxim would develop this idea into the Maxim, remembered as the first machine gun in history. But the very first patent that Maxim makes in this direction specifically concerns a Winchester carbine with a knee joint closure, modified in such a way as to automatically reload with the force of the recoil. It is the very legacy of the concept of recoil operation. Maxim then carries forward this idea of automating the knee joint. It will be much more radical in his Maxim machine gun, but even today, if we see how a Maxim works inside, it has a gigantic knee joint. To complete the closure, here comes the third actor in play, the most important of these listed, even before getting to Georg Luger, obviously. This is about Hugo Borchardt. Hugo Borchardt was a German who, quite young in the 1860s, emigrated to the United States of America. It's not clear where he received technical training, but he was certainly a person who jumped around a lot of companies, working in many different companies on various different projects. He was certainly a person with technical talent, and for a long period of his cheerful life, he linked his name to various American firearms companies. He will go through Colt, he will go through Winchester, he will then also go through Sharps. With Sharps, he will cement his name in one of the rifles of that company, the so-called Sharps Borchardt, indeed. He will also work extensively within Sharps. On the Lee Loader project, James Paris Lee, another American who is the father of the modern loader, Sharps at that time held the production rights for the Lee Loader. In 1881, he returns to Europe, ends up in Hungary, in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, at the Fegyver-Szgépgyár in Budapest, the Tegvérszgépgyár, the most important Hungarian arms company indeed. And he was working right at the Fegyver-Szgépgyár. He will get his hands on the very first self-loading weapons, namely the Maxims, where he will find the very familiar knee joint system because he worked at Winchester. This time, however, applied to a self-loading weapon, also passing through Winchester by indirect ways. He briefly returns to the United States. Between 1890 and 1891, he works for Remington, where he tries to perfect what was the Remington. Lee called him back to Remington precisely because they needed to improve the magazine. In those years, the United States was testing a new rifle. The Americans had particular needs at that time. Regarding the loading system, Borchardt actually patented an improved Lee magazine, which you can see now. In the end, Remington didn't win because the Krag-Jorgensen won in 1892, a weapon I hope to bring you soon. It was the first smokeless powder rifle used by the United States, Denmark, and Norway. In the disappointment and defeat of Remington and his idea, he returns again to Europe. This time he will return to his native Germany, where he will be hired by the gigantic company of Ludwig Loewe. Ludwig Loewe was more than a company, it was a conglomerate. For example, Loewe owned Mauser, which often operated as a completely independent company in terms of contracts and inventions, but also somehow linked to the parent company of Loewe. In short, it was a conglomerate, we could say, of companies. There by now, Borchardt, as a mature inventor full of many experiences, decides to embark on a new invention. In fact, what he will do is take the mechanism of the Winchester already taken by Maxim and shrink it. He actually wanted to make a pistol, not a machine gun. This pistol is compatible with a modern magazine because he was familiar with James Paris Lee's magazines and had patented one himself, which is what we actually consider the modern magazine, bringing to life the unusual pistol known as Construction 93 or C93. The Borchardt, in its steampunk appearance, combines a series of very interesting elements. Also, for example, it has a grip trigger mechanism, magazine release, and modern magazines. The Borchardt is regarded as the first commercially successful self-loading pistol. There were prototypes before the Borchardt, but prototypes that didn't go anywhere. The Borchardt was the first pistol truly put into production. And it's interesting to note how other weapons that will come later, as far as loading systems are concerned, will go towards dead ends. The Borchardt was the first successful self-loading pistol. It already had a magazine, as we understand it, with the magazine release as we understand it, Nathan, precisely because it derived from the work of the father of the modern magazine, namely James Paris Lee. But Vlad, but what is that terrible bubo? That was the problem with the Borchardt. In fact, to operate that little knee in the same Winchester or in the same Maxim, a lot of space is used. As I told you earlier, the point of the little knee is to keep all the elements in line for a solid closure. If instead I apply a force perpendicular to the axis of these elements, the little knee will bend, break to allow the shutter cycle. That curved part on the back of the Borchardt is exactly for this. The little knee from the inside previously hits against this curved part. The end of the little knee comes down, and in this way the little knee itself bends the rest of that bobbin. An American YouTuber called it a tumor and noted its strange spiral recovery spring. In short, there are many good and bad ideas. The Swiss and their army are involved. The Swiss, as you well know, were very interested in the topic of small and rapidly launched ammunition. They were the first to adopt a revolver, even a black powder one, which still had a small caliber ball that was launched quite quickly. It was revolutionary then, but with smoke powder's arrival, they realized it wasn't enough. The problem is revolvers are not particularly efficient in the use of energy. The revolvers that are damn obsolete today. By the late 19th century, the Swiss had already noticed inherent problems with revolvers. They especially have a space between the drum and the barrel, which lets a lot of gas escape. And we're not talking about a little gas, we're talking about a loss of speed of 15-20%. Wanting to have a bullet with the maximum mechanical efficiency, we could say that it made the most of the propellant charge. It's due to their obsession with small, fast bullets, leading them to explore self-loading weapons. Self-loading weapons, in fact, obviously did not have this space and therefore made the most of the acceleration given to the bullet. They used all the powder. The important 20% wasn't lost. In 1897, the Swiss started testing. Bergmann Mannlicher pistols are compared. The C93 of Borchardt and the C96 of Mauser. The C96 of Mauser. It will be a big, let's call it, wake-up call for the rest of the self-loading weapons world, because it will perhaps be the first pistol that will really sell well, the C96. We haven't seen it on the channel yet, but from afar, despite the antiquated look and bizarre appearance, it's much simpler than you imagine. Think that, for example, mechanically speaking, it's the father of the Beretta 92. It actually uses a falling block like there is in the Beretta. However, there are some things that the Swiss don't like about the C96, which they find in the C93. The C93, however, is a bit crap ergonomically. Sorry for the term. They asked Borchardt to improve the C93, but he refuses. Arrogantly, he believed the pistol couldn't be improved and he'd done his best, yet he was still considering other inventions. Just think, he was throwing himself on the gas versions, just as Maxim had done before. There was a person, however, who had worked intimately to help Borchardt in his development of that weapon and most likely had developed the ammunition. We are obviously talking about Georg Luger. I say probably because much later Georg Luger, in 1922, during a legal case, will claim that he was the one who invented the ammunition. Borchardt was still alive and did nothing. Also, its construction closely resembled Gewehr 88 ammunition which Luger worked on at one point. And the fact that after the modification very quickly strongly suggests that it was indeed Georg Luger who used it, who invented it. Firstly, Georg Luger, born in 1849, was a Tyrolean. After elementary school in Tyrol, think of Padua, then in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, to study. Georg Luger. He'll speak several languages, including fluent Italian, and we'll see him in Italy soon. He joins the Austrian army, where he will become an officer. At some point, he finishes the musketry school. He was also an excellent shooter in the army. But he ends up actually dealing with accounting. Returning to civilian work, at some point, he will continue to work in accounting. And actually, again, here it is not well understood. In his biography, there are precisely these missing pieces. How did he start working with firearms? We definitely know that around 1888 he ended up working for Ludwig Luger. And thanks to his knowledge of both the military world and languages, he often ends up doing some work of representation, presenting the company's products to military commissions and whatever else. Think that Georg Luger is heavily involved in the Italian tests that will see the adoption of the Carcano. In fact, the Germans at that time were trying to sell the Motor 1890 to Italy, which, with all due respect to the Carcano, we know its history. It would have been a better choice. Even more so, this is just an anecdote. It is said that Georg Luger tried to persuade an Italian high-ranking officer's wife with favors in order to manipulate him. To adopt the Mauser, let's say, sometimes you have to sell. In 1893, as noted, he works at Borchardt and likely develops the ammunition. In 1894, however, we see him in dispute with Mauser, so in dispute with a subsidiary of his own company. Something interesting happened. The Mauser 98S have a third locking lug, a feature we've consistently observed in these rifles. Georg Luger had a patent on that thing. He sued Mauser, who at that time still the 98 was not adopted, but they were already developing. This idea, he sued and even won. Mauser had to pay him a lot of money for infringing on his patent. Now it's not very clear because Mauser rifles with this third locking tenon appear significantly before Georg Luger's patent. Let's say it between the Italian officer's wife's issue and the third locking tenon patent. Between Luger and Mauser, there was no love lost, but they all worked for the same company, in fact. In 1896, it will change its name. After the death of Ludwig Löwe, in fact, it will become the Deutsche Waffen- und Munitionsfabriken. This name change was also driven by the fact that Ludwig Löwe was of Jewish origin. And the debut of the Gewehr 88, a weapon that had a lot of problems, which was produced by them, which was also produced by Löwe, but not designed. It caused some anti-Semitism toward the company. It wasn't 1939, but times weren't good. With the new name and the new board, we come back to the date we saw, 1897, where the Swiss tests take place. Borchardt refuses to improve the pistol, but Georg Luger is eager to do so. The Swiss army also has several improvements it wants. Obviously, the number one concerns the ergonomics of the weapon, to remove that bump that is on the back of the weapon. Here we see a first patent from 1899. Remember that patents often come later than the weapon itself. In this 1899 patent, we see that the pistol is already much smaller in size, even though the knee opens in the same way as the Borchardt. A subsequent patent from 1900, even though in reality we have a gun from 1899 that already does this. It breaks the knee in a completely different way. In fact, instead of lowering the back, it raises the center where the conjunction of the two moving parts is. This famous movement, this famous force, perpendicular to the axis of the closure, is obtained thanks to a series of diagonal surfaces, actually on the outside of the weapon. This will be extremely clear when we move the camera and see how it works. The Luger, moreover, will make a series of modifications. For example, at a certain point, a safety will be added to the grip, which will then be carried. It will change the ammunition to change the angle of the magazine. The Luger's grip angle is far more aggressive and inclined than the Borchardt's. Also, having moved the recovery spring, it was previously in the Borchardt's hump, now it is instead in the grip itself. Shorter ammunition was needed. Luger thus develops the 765 Parabellum or 765 Luger precisely. The Luger won the Swiss competition in the end, and the Swiss were the first to adopt this pistol in 1900. It's a Luger known as the old model. Collectors actually divide Lugers into two branches. In fact, there will be a series of improvements to the Luger that will mainly see it slightly downsized, very slightly from afar. Hard to notice. Vlad shoots, time's running out, and we haven't reached Germany. The P08. Okay. After adopting the Gewehr 88, the first smoke powder rifle, the Germans will focus on modernizing the rest of the arsenal. They will focus a lot on the issue of the machine gun, first of all, and will let the issue of the handgun run a bit. They will be very slow to conduct tests, very slow to choose the handgun, which, let's say, is not very important. They first considered revolvers, but like the Swiss, decided they weren't ideal because they lost gas and power. The first practical test took place in 1898, which saw the Luger especially opposed to the Mauser C96, which initially was much more liked by the military. So much so that at one point the issue was almost declared closed. Then there was a second test, however, in 1902, as Luger was gradually improving it. This test, also driven by the fact that the Swiss had adopted it to arrive at a field test in 1903. In the midst of this field test in 1903, Luger made another change that had again started overseas. It's remarkable how closely Luger's history is tied to the United States. At that time, Americans were also testing self-loading pistols. The Americans, however, for no reason in the world wanted a small caliber, spoiled a bit by the so-called poor Thompson-Lagarde tests. We have seen this in the past. You can retrieve them in video tests during which the myth of stopping power of the slow and heavy bullet was born. The Americans didn't want a 7.65 bullet, they wanted the biggest thing possible. As a quick solution, Luger took the 7.65 parabellum case, expanded the neck, and managed to fit a 9mm bullet. Thus, the 9x19 parabellum or 9x19 Luger was born. The Americans, however, rejected it. That's another story. There will also be Lugers in .45 automatic Colt pistol for the American tests. But the new 9mm bullet, the new 9mm ammunition was much more liked by the German army. First of all, in the middle of the 1903 tests, Luger proposed to replace some of the pistols with the new 9x-19 pistols. The weapons were very well liked, but the German bureaucracy continued to be slow. The first to adopt the Luger in 9x-19 at that time was the 04 pistol. From 1904, it will be the German Navy. After 4 years, and after the adoption by the German Navy, the slow bureaucracy of Germany and the German Imperial Army will finally come to a decision. And, as you surely know from the name of the weapon, it will officially adopt it in 1908. The story continues, as today we have a World War II Luger. In fact, in 1938, Nazi Germany will adopt the Walter P08 as its standard pistol. But Walter was nowhere near capable of producing enough numbers for the war effort. So the companies that were already producing the P08 or had the machinery to produce the P08 will continue to do so. In fact, it will be a weapon that will essentially be produced in parallel with the P38. For the Germans, it wasn't the first choice, but it was a choice they knew and could make many of. So let's finally move the camera. Let's take a closer look. We disassemble the P08 to see its materials and workings, then test it at the range. Here we are with this great Luger P08. First, we notice some details. We obviously have a sight on the barrel. The barrel is bare, that is, there is nothing covering it. This is a fairly typical characteristic of the very first self-loading pistols. We've seen these things, for example, in weapons like the C96 or the Walther P38. Although the entire barrel is exposed, this makes it more vulnerable to damage and increases the risk of burns during frequent firing. The obvious advantage, of course, is that everything is lighter. I also want to point out something important to you. This is a production of the 40s. It has some features that are typical of late production Lugers. The knee pad was changed to simplify production during World War II. It has a second type of extractor, so-called long extractor, which also doubles as a chamber cartridge indicator if there is a shot or not. And third most important thing, it does less of the safety on the grip. The very first Lugers, starting from the Swiss ones, the first adopted indeed had the safety on the grip. From the time that the grip has the point to mount a holster to the buttstock. Too bad they didn't issue them, they probably didn't even produce them, but they did it anyway, because they are Germans, you never know. We have the typical trigger with this half-moon shape, very particular. The weapon may look unergonomic from a distance, but you'll see it in action during the fire test. It's really comfortable to hold, and it naturally falls into the hand. The Luger is among the most ergonomic weapons ever made. They don't make them like this now. Because above all, having such an aggressive angle on the grip potentially causes feeding problems, especially if you use larger magazines or double stack magazines. The lever shown here will be used for disassembly, which we'll do in a very modern way. We have on the left side the button to remove the magazine. The magazine has a capacity of 8 rounds, as you can see from the right side. The magazine controls its elevator for loading. Here the spring, particularly of this magazine, is particularly hard. We have to say that it is particularly hard. And the weapon also goes into hold open when it runs out of rounds. So this is also a very important thing. What does the magazine do to the toggle system? We'll get there now, but the last command I wanted to show you is the safety in this position the weapon can fire. If the weapon is safe, nothing happens. Let's see this bar that rises to block the mechanism and, among other things, also blocks the toggle from opening. As you can see, the weapon can't be opened to arm. We have to remove the safety to perform these operations and to press the trigger. So, quite effective in these two things, in blocking the operation and the trigger mechanism. Now we get to the heart of the system because we've really talked a lot about the knee system from its inception, going very, very, very far back in time. From how Borchardt had thought of it and how Luger improved its operation. I find the Luger extremely interesting for a simple reason. Let me explain. In self-loading weapons, there is typically a component that uses short recoil or gas operation, which transforms the horizontal movement, whether it's of the bolt carrier or the bolt barrel group in recoil weapons, into an unlocking movement of the bolt itself. Sometimes I say that to understand weapons, what operates them, in what way they are going to open. We have to imagine where is the hand that moves them, the mechanical hand that moves them. For example, think for a moment about the Kalashnikov, the diagonal cams that rotate the bolt. That, in a certain sense, is the hand that rotates everything. I find the Luger interesting because the hand here is in front of our eyes all the time. The back of the Luger has this round shape because it's not a coincidence, because this is a fundamental part of the weapon's operation. We have the knee joint, so first part, second part here. Of course, the knee joint can be broken and aligned with the barrel. When the ammunition puts pressure during the explosion, purely putting pressure back on this knee joint, it cannot open because the geometry of the parts prevents it. So we have a force on this axis that has no way to open this knee joint. We have to apply a force anyway parallel to this movement to break this knee joint. When I operate the weapon, my hand does it simply by lifting it and pulling it back. Very clear as what? So when the weapon recoils, this round part of the knee hits against this surface. Rounded diagonal surface. Now it's hard to do it with force, but look when it goes against it. If I still force it, it starts to rise. You see it rises. Look, but you struggle with the spring a lot. Very strong at this point, at this moment. So it's simply this that causes the breakage of the kneecap, let's say. And so the cycle of the weapon is short recoil, precisely because in this stretch of recoil, the bolt is perfectly closed and solid with the barrel. From this moment, the opening movement begins. It's very fast as a thing, but enough to lower the pressure to safe levels. In this way, you can indeed safely use the weapon, and the weapon works without exploding or sending pieces of its own shells everywhere. Operation is quite intuitive and indeed still deriving a lot from the past. From the volcanic, through indirect routes, passing through Winchester, then through Borchardt, who refuses to improve it. Indeed, we heard the Ambararam before, the long history lesson, so it doesn't make much sense to repeat. We can take a closer look at how it's built and how it works, obviously, by disassembling it. To do this, we have to do this. The best thing is to use the charger to activate the hold open. Here we go. As you can see, the knee remains in hold open. Here you can see very, very well how it's made. Now we have to rotate this lever that is used for disassembly because it doesn't even want to rotate. Okay, we rotate it. In this way, we can lift this plate, let's call it this way, which partly also hides the mechanism of the trigger chain. Do you see the trigger moving? Can we release the hold open at this moment? And as you can see, separate the gun's frame from the barrel and the bolt itself. Let's examine the gun's frame before continuing with disassembly. There are many surprises. Here you see just this lever that actually internally holds the barrel with the bolt, but also holds that plate and needs to be removed for this disassembly. The trigger system is quite interesting because it goes sideways. I'll show you a few things with the magazine. As you can see, it sticks out significantly from the weapon. This lever that has risen, as you see it rising at this moment, is nothing more than the hold open. And the interesting thing, we use this protrusion to help us load the weapon, but it's precisely that which activates the hold open. So it's important that it's there. It's not just aesthetic, it's not just to help us with the loading. But when it reaches the end of its course, as you can see, it raises this lever and activates the hold open, which will indeed hold the bolt in opening. It seems that in the Luger there is a lot of dead space because you see there is the magazine, but the feed ramp is much larger. Actually, it's not like that because behind here there is a compartment, let's call it separate, that comes up to this component that I can't even move because it's very hard. But that one at the inner beginning is nothing more than the recoil spring. The recoil spring is very interesting, which actually acts on the shutter carriage passing through this lever. In fact, when we reassemble it, we have to be careful, actually, that this element is correctly hooked to those two claws we saw, which connect it with the recoil spring. Here we see a little better precisely the knee. Without the pressure of the spring, we see how it controls the shutter. Properly speaking, thus opening, we also notice the extractor. And we see how this knee precisely is fixed to this extension of the barrel, which makes it one with the barrel, precisely. We can remove this pin, this large pin, to separate the two parts. We do it. We try to do it manually with the tool. Remember that there is a correct direction. That is, if you look at it this way, it goes from right to left. It's coming out easily. Here it is. The pin, as you can see, is a bit wider on one side, so don't force it. It has its correct direction. And in this way, we can simply slide the shutter with the knee from the barrel and from this huge extension of the barrel that goes to contain and guide it. Normally in these weapons, there are guides inside the frame of the slide, but as you can see, the frame is quite Spartan. Here, what would normally be the slide guides we find as a single part, attached to the barrel. The actual bolt, as we have seen, is the hinge, which, when perfectly aligned in this way, does not allow its movement relative to the extension of the barrel. Very clear as what? When everything is externally opened, how much can you instead go to move? Simple or complicated, seen differently? I'm trying something new with this video. We use World of Guns, which is basically a game. But it's also a large database of 3D firearm models, many of which are extremely well made. I wanted to show you the trigger and disconnection mechanism. First, let's virtually remove the plate that we saw during the disassembly. Now, when I press the trigger will actually transfer its force horizontally into the weapon. To this bar, look. A few things happen here. So first of all, I have the trigger, properly speaking, which with a kind of diagonal cam, I don't know how to explain it to you for lack of other terms. It spins and pushes. This extension of this element that we could call the trigger tooth, a force transfer bar towards this other bar. Inside, let's look again. Now forgive me, but I'm going to put some colors on that will let you see the various parts a bit better. Now this bar, as we've seen, is pressed inward. The English, or more specifically the game's models, in this case he calls it trigger lever or trigger lever, while this bar that is pressed is called in this case shear bar or snap tooth bar. I would like to show you something interesting because let me virtually remove the snap tooth bar. Here the trigger bar has this element, in this case orange, made to show that it has its own spring. When we go to shoot, as long as the trigger is held down, it does not engage with the trigger bar, only releasing the trigger. It will snap into position, preparing the weapon for a second shot. To see what happens even more internally, we will have to remove a little more parts. So we virtually remove everything that happens around. We can thus appreciate precisely this shear bar, or the snap tooth bar, and the snap tooth itself. This blue one is its spring, and the striker launched inside the weapon. When this is pressed inward, the other side will go outward, releasing the trigger mechanism. We press the trigger, and the striker is released. Let's view it differently. I press the trigger here, the bar presses inward. which in turn presses the firing bar, which in turn going out. Here it is. Look at the movement, it releases the striker. We reassemble the weapon to go and get it for a nice fire test. We put the shutter with the knee, we go to make it pass over. We'll struggle a bit with the extractor's spring, especially in the final stretch. It's a bit of a magic trick to reassemble everything, but we can align this eyelet for lack of other terms. And we can insert the pin that will be well aligned. And it holds it. It might be hard to see, but sorry, but I have to align it, and once aligned, it should go in very, very smoothly. Here it is, in fact, the doctorate can be completely closed in this way. Now we simply put the weapon, the group of the barrel, and the breech on the frame. Be careful, because at this point we have to make sure that lever hooks onto that lever. If we hold it vertically, now is the time to turn it. Okay, let's put the magazine in for a moment to see if it goes into hold open correctly. Let's see if I have a tension on the spring. In fact, I don't have a tension on the spring. Let's try again. Now, yes, now attention on the spring. Now I've put it right. Excellent. Let's keep it as far back as possible, because we'll have to put this plate back and simply turn this pin into position. The weapon is ready to use again. Let's try it for fun. And here we are, finally trying out this Luger, as you can see. First of all, we have a large plate, a large gong, about 12 meters away. Since you always complain I never show you the target, you insist you get it. This shot, we insert the magazine, we go to arm the system. Let's see. The weapon when it's unloaded. It goes into this hold open. Now that you've seen the plates move, Vlad, why don't you show the target? Because there's not much to show about accuracy when shooting this way. To do serious accuracy tests, you need to mount the weapon, because we generally don't do these tests. Also, what's the point of shooting like this at paper and showing it in a newspaper article? It doesn't make sense to me, since it tells me nothing about the weapon's mechanical accuracy. But, well, aside from my thoughts here, ranting as the English say, let's move the camera, try some other angles, some other shots, some other targets, and then of course I'll tell you what I think. From the holster we insert the magazine. Let's try with two hands. Not a historic shot, but let's see. High malfunction. We forgive the weapon, but this one is old and not in the best condition. Why do they go so high? In fact, I have to aim at the lower limit of the target. I used to get everything, but now it's missing some. The shots are bad, but it's fine. We're having some fun, just with early feelings. This weapon mixes modern and terribly obsolete ergonomics. For example, it has a normal magazine release, where it should be, so the magazine can be removed with one hand. But for example, it has the bolt handle to load it. This movement of grabbing the bolt handle, pulling it up and back to load the weapon, is a very deliberate, very precise movement. It's not like modern guns where you pull them out of the holster or things like that. You take it, put your hand over it with the Glock and pull everything back together. Because it's a huge cart, you really have to go with two fingers, pull back and let go, let go. Among other things, let go quite violently. All weapons want it, but here in particular, if a minimum, well, you accompany it. This then is the effect. We load, we try again, and continue to describe the properties and qualities of this weapon. Among other things, we have the holster. But if there's one thing I don't like, it's the old, ancient style of the cross-draw. It is big movement. You have to give almost all of the shoulder. I'm not surprised that this thing has changed. And then you have to point the barrel at everyone who is around from the left side. The normal holsters, let's call them modern, are a little bit better. Again, magazine, again, magazine. Let's see. And the weapon is unloaded. Okay, Vlad, but are you sure you checked the weapons? Those comments are there too, as if it wasn't enough to have worked in this environment. And the angle of the grips is very pleasant, frankly. This weapon is almost instinctively aimed. There's a reason why many precision shooting pistols have these angles on the grips. The sights are not perfect, or rather the sight is very visible and wide due to these anti-reflective millings that we also saw during the disassembly. That which, if desired, could be improved. The sight notch is small, it has a very small cut, we've seen it. In practice, you can make extremely precise shots, but in the easy acquisition of a target, it could be a bit more difficult. In fact, speaking of quick acquisition of a target. Let's do another test. So we have a silhouette of a villain about 20 meters away. Now let's do this other precision test. Let's call it static, and then we try things a bit more difficult, maybe a bit more lively. Let's see how it fares with precision, especially how I fare. Being a dog, a crazy dog, let's see. Nice, it loaded the shot. No, in fact, it's not next. Okay, and the weapon is unloaded. I'm a bit of a dog at shooting, as you can see, but with a relatively not very slow, not very aimed shot, you can still get results. I repeat, the biggest difficulty with the Luger is that darn tiny sight notch. I assure you that with, especially for a quicker engagement, the sight notch a bit bigger. I think of the Glocks, or trivially the 92Fs, is a little bit faster, but the weapon is mechanically very precise because the barrel only moves on one axis. One of the skills and one of the useful things to learn with the pistol is definitely the transition to the target. There you can also see the quality of many sights, and the transition to the target is important. So much so, think that there are also Olympic sports, or rather an Olympic shooting sport, where it's all about transitioning to the target. I'm talking about the automatic pistol, but we have these 3 irons. Let's try to hit all 3 in sequence. Okay, I can't do it, but I have to hold it with both hands. It's the natural instinct to do so. Okay, let's see. High. We made it too high. They are not sights for precision shooting, or rather to hit the center of the target. But the belly swells with these sights to say under the center of mass. Mass to here at the belt, we could say. To hit the target, we need to adjust the camera on the head for a moment and try something else. The Luger is certainly a very interesting weapon that we saw today, a bit tested with these shots. We saw it disassembled, we saw it narrated, it was a milestone, but it was also a dead end. I find it amusing, but I can perfectly appreciate because then it didn't go anywhere. We also need to understand in a certain sense what was wrong in the history of weapons in order to truly appreciate what we have today. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please like and comment. It helps the YouTube algorithm immensely, which doesn't like firearms at all. If possible, subscribe to contribute more to the channel. I remind you that doing these things, especially posting 3 times a week videos about weapons, is not free for my pockets. I'm not rich, so if you'd like, use the link in the description to subscribe to the channel. For example, the channel wouldn't exist without merchandising like the shirts I wear in the videos. Without people like you who offer me to try their firearms. When they ask me, Vlad, but where did you get all these weapons? They're not mine. Are you the one suggesting them to me? So thanks today to Good Paul, who you've already met in the past, for providing me with his Luger to do these tests today. This video, we, as always, see you next time. Thanks to everyone.